A few hours ago, we decided to take a break from studying in order to create a brand new video for you and upload it to our channel. We began watching the whole way through a conspiracy video on the US $1 bill and all that pertains to that, which talked about US President Roosevelt, a guy called Wallace, and a mystic guru and so forth, who got together and designed that which is on the $1 bill, the all-seeing eye and so forth, and talked about a magical stone, supposedly the pillow, the rock, the pillow that Jacob in the Bible rested on, had a dream of the ladder going from heaven to earth and the angels going up and down. It's really good, really informative, really interesting. And then we followed it up by watching another documentary later on, this one here titled Creating Christ, a documentary which looks at the archaeological evidence that now links the first Christians with the ruling elites of Rome, and it features James.A.Valliant and Warren Fahey, as well as Dr. Robert Price, Professor Robert Eisenman, and Achara Sanning, which she's into the secular belief system, right? The psychic thing and all that sort of stuff. Okay, so we were struck by the fact that this man here uttered something. Okay, something he said prompted us to go and find information. Okay, so we wanted the accurate information, so we asked AI this question: did Josephus in his writings ever say Vespasian was the Messiah Jesus? No, it replied. Flavius Josephus never said that Vespasian was Jesus the Messiah. Here's what he actually did say and how it's often misunderstood. 1. Josephus' prophecy about Vespasian. In his work The Jewish War, Josephus describes being captured by the Romans during the First Jewish-Roman War, and then he's adopted by the Flavians. That's why it was called Joseph Flavius, or Flavius Josephus. While a prisoner, he told Vespasian that he would become emperor. When that later happened, Josephus claimed it fulfilled a Jewish oracle about a world ruler coming from Judea. This is the key point. Josephus reinterpreted a Jewish prophecy to apply to Vespasian. He did not identify Vespasian as a Jewish Messiah in the religious sense. He certainly did not say Vespasian was Jesus Christ. 2. Josephus on Jesus. Josephus does mention Jesus in Antiquities of the Jews, the famous Testimonium Flavianum, but he treats Jesus as a separate figure. The passage, as preserved, acknowledges Jesus as a wise man and crucified teacher. Many scholars think parts of that passage were later modified by Christians, but it still shows Josephus knew of Jesus as distinct from Roman rulers. 3. Why the confusion exists. Some modern theories suggest the prophecy Josephus applied to Vespasian was originally Messianic. Therefore, some speculate Romans replaced a Jewish Messiah with Vespasian, but this is speculative and not supported by Josephus' own words. Bottom line, Josephus never equated Vespasian with Jesus. He never called Vespasian the Messiah as in a Christian sense. He simply claimed Vespasian fulfilled a vague Jewish oracle about a future ruler. The Jews wanted a Messiah, they wanted a deliverer, someone who would overthrow the Roman rule, sit on the throne as king, and restore Israel back to the Jews. But Jesus never did that. He didn't come for that purpose. And then this AI says, I can show you the exact passage Josephus wrote and break it down line by line. So I said, yeah, okay, show me please. And it stated, here's the key passage from the Jewish War, Book 3, Chapter 8, where Flavius Josephus explains the prophecy. But now, what did most elevate them in undertaking this war was an ambiguous oracle that was also found in their sacred writings. How about that time one from their country should become governor of the habitable earth. The Jews took this prediction to belong to themselves in particular, but this oracle certainly denoted the government of Vespasian, who was appointed emperor in Judea. What Josephus is actually doing here? He says there was a vague prophecy and ambiguous oracle in Jewish scriptures. Many Jews thought it meant a Jewish ruler, Messiah. Josephus claims that they were wrong, and that it really referred to Vespasian becoming emperor. Important details. Josephus calls it ambiguous, not a clear messianic prediction. He reinterprets it after the fact, once Vespasian becomes emperor. He uses it to explain why the Jews revolted during the First Jewish-Roman War. What he does not say. He never mentions Jesus Christ in this passage. He never says Vespasian is a Messiah in the religious or Jewish sense. He never connects Vespasian with Christian beliefs at all. Why this matters. Josephus is essentially explaining Jewish expectations, then redirecting them to flatter his Roman patron Vespasian, or Kisbat, right? It's a means of survival, isn't it? Most historians see this as political survival and loyalty, not theology. AI says it could show me the passage where Josephus talks about Jesus and compares the tone. It really highlights how differently he treats the two. So I said, yes, please do. Here are the two key passages side by side so you can see the difference clearly. 1. Josephus on Jesus. From Antiquities of the Jews, Book 18, the Testimonium Flavianum. At this time there was a wise man called Jesus Christ, if indeed one ought to call him a man. He was a doer of wonderful works. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Christ, or the Anointed One, in the Greek. And when Pontius Pilate, or Pontius Pilate, condemned him to the cross, those who had first loved him did not cease, for he appeared to them alive again the third day. He died, was resurrected, right? Rose again, according to scriptures. Important note, most scholars believe parts like he was a Christ were likely added or edited by later Christians, but the core idea that Jesus existed, was crucified and had followers is widely accepted as authentic. So he existed, he wasn't a myth. 2. Josephus on Vespasian. From the Jewish War, Book 3, an ambiguous oracle that one from their country should become governor of the world. This oracle certainly denoted the government of Vespasian. Side-by-side comparison, tone and purpose on Jesus. Describes a teacher and miracle worker, mentions followers and crucifixion, possibly depending on version, calls him Christ. Reads like a historical notice about a religious figure. On Vespasian. No miracles, no teachings, no religious role, just a political ruler. Interprets a prophecy after the fact. Key difference. Jesus is treated, at least minimally, as a religious figure people followed. Vespasian is treated as a political fulfillment of a vague oracle. The big takeaway. Flavius Josephus separates the two completely. Never links Vespasian with Jesus Christ. Uses different language, context and purpose for each. If someone claims Josephus said Vespasian was Jesus or the Messiah, they're blending two unrelated passages, ignoring the context, or relying on modern reinterpretations, not Josephus himself. AI goes on to say, if I liked, it could go one level deeper and show how Roman propaganda and later theories like the Roman invention of Christianity idea try to connect these, but where they break down. So I ask it, okay, what did Josephus actually say before later Christians changed it? It replies, great question. This gets right to one of the most debated passages in ancient history. What did Flavius Josephus originally write about Jesus? The passage in Antiquities of the Jews, Book 18, that mentions Jesus Christ was likely partly altered by later Christian scribes. So, scholars try to reconstruct a more neutral version, what Josephus, a non-Christian Jew, would plausibly have written. And as a backup, we know of atheist or agnostic atheist theologian Bart D. Ehrman saying, yeah, these Christians probably later on changed it or added Jesus Christ in Josephus's works because suddenly he changes the style of writing. Most widely accepted reconstruction simplified. Here's a commonly accepted stripped down version. At this time there was a wise man named Jesus. He performed surprising deeds and was the teacher of people who gladly accept the truth. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. When Pontius Pilate condemned him to the cross, those who had loved him did not cease, and the tribe of Christians named after him has not disappeared to this day. What was likely removed or changed? Most scholars think these lines were added later by Christians. It keeps mentioning that. If indeed one ought to call him a man, he was the Christ. He appeared to them alive again the third day, according to scriptures, right? Why? Because Josephus was not a Christian. He never professed his belief in Jesus elsewhere. These lines sound like Christian faith statements, not neutral history. Why scholars are confident something original was there. Even though it was edited, most historians agree Josephus did mention Jesus because the passage fits the flow and style of the surrounding text once cleaned up. Early Christian writers like Origen refer to Josephus mentioning Jesus, but note he did not accept Jesus as the Christ. The passage appears in all surviving manuscripts, though altered by later Christians, supposedly. A second, more secure reference. Josephus also mentions Jesus briefly in Book 20. The brother of Jesus, who is called Christ, whose name was James. This is widely accepted as authentic because it's short and neutral. It doesn't promote Christianity. It matches Josephus' style of writing. Bottom line, the most likely original Josephus acknowledged Jesus as a real person, described him as a teacher with followers, reported his execution under Pontius Pilate, did not say he was the Messiah or divine. And then AI says, I can show you the Arabic version of the passage, which some think preserves a less edited form. It's really interesting and a bit different. Okay, so I asked, did he Josephus just referred to him as the man or man of righteousness? This is what we came across, right? Short answer, Josephus most likely referred to Jesus simply as a wise man, not specifically as a man of righteousness. What wording did Josephus likely use? In the reconstructed version of Antiquities of the Jews, Flavius Josephus probably wrote something like, at this time there was a wise man named Jesus Christ. The Greek phrase behind this is sophos ene, which means wise man or learned man. Where does righteous man come from? That wording likely comes from later Christian interpretations or confusion with other descriptions of holy figures in Jewish literature. Josephus does not explicitly call Jesus righteous man, dikaios ane, or any formal moral title like that. A related clue, James, Jesus' brother. In another passage, Josephus mentions James, the brother of Jesus, who is called Christ. Later Christian writers like Origen describe James as the just, i.e. righteous. But that title does not come from Josephus directly. It may have influenced later assumptions about Jesus too. Why wise man matters. Wise man in Josephus' time could imply a teacher, a philosopher, someone respected for insight. It's respectful but not religiously committed, very consistent with Josephus' writing as a non-Christian. Bottom line, Josephus likely called Jesus a wise man, not explicitly a righteous man, and definitely not the Messiah in his own voice. Okay, then AI goes on to suggest that it could show me the exact Greek wording and how different scholars translate each phrase. That's where the nuances get really interesting. Okay, so I asked, did he just refer to him as the man? No, Flavius Josephus did not call Jesus Christ the man. The most likely original wording was, at this time there was a wise man named Jesus. Why not just the man? The key Greek phrase is sophos enia, and there is in the Greek, a literally wise man. If Josephus had meant just the man, he would have used enia alone, simply man. But he adds sophos, wise, which is important. What that implies. By saying wise man, Josephus is giving a respectful but neutral description, presenting Jesus as a teacher or notable figure, not making any religious claim about him. It's similar to how he describes other teachers or philosophers, where the confusion comes from. The fuller version, as preserved by Christians, says, if indeed one ought to call him a man. That line suggests Jesus is more than human, but most scholars agree that part was added later. It's not what Josephus originally wrote. Bottom line. No, not just the man. No, not the righteous man. There's a tick here. Most likely a wise man named Jesus. And then Ao goes on to say, I can break down the entire sentence word for word from the Greek so you can use you can see exactly how scholars reconstruct it. So I said, yeah, okay, do it, please. Great. Let's look at the actual Greek wording and unpack it step by step. The key line in Greek from Antiquities of the Jews, book 18, as preserved. Here it is in the Greek, referring to Jesus Christ. Word for word breakdown. Egeneto, there arose, there appeared, there was. A standard historical way of introducing a person. And in the Greek, kata toton ton chronon, at this time, sets a historical context. Jesus, Sophos, wise, skilled, learned. Ania, man, specifically an adult male, often with some dignity, with some honours. Put together literally, at this time there was Jesus, a wise man. Why this matters. This tiny phrase tells us a lot about how Flavius Josephus viewed Jesus. Ania, man, confirms he treats Jesus as human. Sophos, wise, gives him respect but not worship. No divine titles, no claim he's the Messiah in the likely original. In contrast with later editions, later manuscripts add, if indeed one ought to call him a man. That would imply Jesus is more than human, but that clashes with Josephus' normal style, which is why scholars see it as a Christian assertion, i.e. but the ermine. Subtle but important nuance. In Greek literature, sophos ania, wise man, can mean a philosopher, a teacher, a wonder worker in some context. So Josephus is likely saying Jesus was a noteworthy teacher type figure. Not just a man, not the Messiah, not divine. Bottom line, the Greek makes it very clear. Josephus didn't say the man, he deliberately wrote a wise man. That's a measured, respectful but non-religious description. Then AI suggests it can go on further into the next phase, do of surprising works. That one is also really interesting and debated. So my reply to it was something different. So the two men, i.e. James.A.Valliant and Warren Fahey, in the documentary The Creating of Christ documentary, lied. These two here, well, specifically this guy, because I don't think he said anything. It's mainly this guy. It's not accurate or fair to jump straight to they lied. A better way to put it is that they're presenting a minority interpretation that most historians don't accept. So this AI is being nice. Yeah. Here's how this fits together. Who are they? Let's be nice and respectful. Who are they? James.A.Valliant, Warren Fahey. They're associated with a documentary, Creating Christ, which argues that Christianity was heavily shaped or even engineered by Roman elites. Flavius Josephus and the Flavian emperors like Vespasian are central to that story. Where their claims differ from mainstream scholarship. 1. Josephus and Jesus. Mainstream view. Josephus did mention Jesus Christ. He called him something like a wise man. Later Christians edited the passage but didn't invent it entirely. Their view is simplified. The passage is more heavily manipulated or part of a broader Roman narrative. Parallels between Jesus and Roman figures like Vespasian or Titus are intentional. Most historians say the parallels are selective and overstated. The textual evidence doesn't support such a large conspiracy. Vespasian as Messiah, mainstream view. Josephus reinterpreted a vague prophecy to flatter Vespasian. This was political, not theological. Their interpretation. This shows Romans were redirecting Jewish Messianic expectations. The issue, that leap goes beyond what Josephus actually says, or actually said. 3. Methodology concerns. Historians are critical because the documentary relies heavily on pattern matching parallels. It often assumes intent, Roman authorship, coordination, without direct evidence. It downplays how messy and diverse early Christianity actually was. So, did they lie? A more precise answer, and it says X here. No, there's no clear evidence that they knowingly fabricated quotes. But they interpret the evidence in a highly controversial way. Their conclusions are considered fringe by the majority of scholars. A helpful way to think about it. Josephus' actual words, limited, cautious, political. Their interpretation, expansive, conspiratorial, connecting many dots. The gap between those two is where the disagreement lies. Bottom line, they didn't need to lie to reach their conclusions, but they stretch the evidence far beyond what it clearly supports. And most experts in ancient history and biblical studies reject their theory. AI then goes on to say it could take one specific claim from the documentary and fact check it line by line against the actual ancient sources. That's usually the clearest way to see where things diverge or differ, right? Or wander off. Another tangent probably. Well, if they say that when they read the works of Josephus said Vespasian was the Messiah, Jesus isn't that Vespasian was the Messiah, Jesus, isn't that a fabrication or a lie? That's what you think, right? It's false or a lie. If someone explicitly claims that Flavius Josephus wrote that Vespasian was Jesus or the Messiah Jesus, then yes, that statement is factually incorrect based on the actual text we have. But whether that counts as a lie depends on intent or their intention. What Josephus actually says, clear facts from the Jewish War. He says a vague prophecy about a world ruler was fulfilled by Vespasian. He does not use the word Messiah for Vespasian. So when you're looking at world ruler, he's not talking about the entire world. Okay, America, Australia, New Zealand, or the Pacific, because they don't know of that yet. They never conquered that yet, or invaded and conquered it yet. Okay, so it's the known world, that which was conquered by the Romans and the Greeks. Okay, he does not use the word Messiah for Vespasian. He does not connect Vespasian to Jesus Christ in any way. From Antiquities of the Jews. He refers to Jesus separately as a wise man. These are two completely different passages about two different people. So what's going on in that claim? If someone says Josephus said Vespasian was the Messiah Jesus, then they are combining two unrelated ideas, adding conclusions Josephus never states, presenting it as it's directly in the text when it isn't. Is that a lie or a misinterpretation? There are two possibilities. One, misinterpretation more charitable, it's being nice. They might mean Josephus reinterpreted a Jewish prophecy to apply to Vespasian, and they're loosely calling that Messianic that's still imprecise and misleading, but not necessarily intentional deception. 2. Fabrication, stronger claim. If they literally say Josephus called Vespasian the Messiah, or identified him with Jesus, then that statement is not found anywhere in Josephus. It would be a false claim about the text. The key distinction. Here's a tick here. Legitimate interpretation. Josephus redirected a prophecy to Vespasian. Wrong. Unsupported claim. Josephus said Vespasian was Jesus the Messiah. These are not the same thing. Bottom line. Josephus never equates Vespasian with Jesus Christ. Saying he did is factually wrong. Whether it's a lie depends on whether the person knows it's wrong, but it is definitely a misrepresentation of the source. AI goes on to say, if you want, it can quote the exact line from the documentary and compare it directly to Josephus as so I can see it precisely where it diverges or where it differs. So say, yeah, please provide it so I can compare it. Here's the actual relevant text from Flavius Josephus, the Jewish War, not Christian interpolation, or changing it, or mucking around for it, right? Adding to it. Showing what he actually wrote about Vespasian and the prophecy, so you can compare it to the documentary claim. Josephus on the prophecy about Vespasian. This is the passage from the Jewish War, Book 6, Section 310, where Josephus explains the prophecy that the Jews interpreted as a sign of a coming ruler. What did the most elevate them in undertaking this war was an ambiguous oracle that was also found in the sacred writings about how about that time one from their country should become governor of the habitable earth. The Jews took this prediction to belong to themselves in particular. Now this oracle certainly denoted the government of Vespasian, who was appointed emperor in Judea. What this passage actually says. Here is what Josephus is doing in the text. 1. There was a vague prophecy in Jewish sacred writings about someone from the country ruling the known world. That's why we say it's not Australia, America, or any other country like that. It's the known world, that which was invaded and conquered by the Romans and the Greeks, etc. 2. Many Jews thought that prophecy referred to a Jewish Messianic leader. Josephus claims the prophecy was really fulfilled by Vespasian becoming Roman emperor. There is no statement here that Vespasian was Jesus or that he was the Messiah Jesus. Why this doesn't say Vespasian is Jesus? The key points are: the prophecy is described as ambiguous, not clearly Messianic in the Jewish sense. Josephus says many Jews misinterpret it as referring to themselves. He insists that denoted Vespasian's government, not a divine saviour figure. There's no mention of Christianity or Jesus in this context. In other words, Josephus is narrating a retrospective interpretation, not making a theological claim that Vespasian was or is Jesus the Messiah. So, how would you compare this to the documentary claim? If the documentary says Josephus wrote that Vespasian was the Messiah Jesus, that is not what Josephus wrote. Instead, Josephus wrote something like, there was a prophecy many Jews thought referred to their own messianic hopes, but the prophecy, in my view, Josephus' view, referred to Vespasian's rise to power. That's a political interpretation, not a religious identity. Here's a summary for comparison. What's claimed and what Josephus actually wrote. Then AI says, if you like, I could also pull up the exact ancient Greek wording of this prophecy passage with translation notes, so we can see, or I can see, the nuance word by word. So I suggest yes, please do. Here is the actual ancient Greek text and a line-by-line translation of the section, the Jewish War, where Josephus discusses the ambiguous prophecy about the future ruler. So you can compare it directly with any claim that he said Vespasian was the Messiah or Jesus. It's the original Greek text from Josephus' book War, or Writings War 6.312 to 313. Literal translation, clause by clause, Greek phrase with line, English meaning, in comparison, what the Greek actually says, important points for comparison. Josephus does not say Vespasian is the Messiah, Vespasian is Jesus, Vespasian fulfilled the Christian Messianic role. He merely claims that Jewish prophecy existed. Many Jews interpret it as a Messianic hope for themselves. He argues it was fulfilled by Vespasian's political rise, not by a spiritual deliverer. How to interpret this in your comparison? If the documentary or its commenters claim Josephus wrote about a prophecy, it's true, but incorrect. If Josephus wrote Vespasian was the Messiah Jesus, it's not what the Greek says. The Greek clearly distinguishes between a vague prophecy, Jewish misinterpretation of that prophecy, Josephus' own political explanation of the same. Final comparison tip. When you compare what the documentary says to the Greek text, look for direct statements in the original. In Greek, Josephus never calls Vespasian the Messiah, much less equates him with Jesus. If the documentary asserts that, it's going beyond the text itself. And then it suggests, I can also show you the exact Greek of the Testimonium Flavianum in the Antiquities, so you can compare how Josephus discusses Jesus versus how he discusses Vespasian. Okay, so I put here James.A.Valliant, this man here, said in that documentary, when I was reading the work of the first century Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, I was struck by something he said, that the man he was working for, the Roman Emperor Vespasian, was in fact the Jewish Messiah of prophecy, in fact another Jesus of the first century. This went against everything I had been taught, or this guy had been taught, right? So that's total blasphemy there, right? If that's what Flavius Josephus actually wrote, okay, about Vespasian. Okay, so AI says, thank you for quoting that directly. Let's break it down carefully and compare it to what the historical sources actually say. Claimed by James.A.Valliant, the man he was working for, the Roman Emperor Vespasian, was in fact the Jewish Messiah of prophecy, in fact another Jesus of the first century. So that's what he's trying to say there, right? That he was the prophesied Messiah, i.e. Jesus the Christ, Jesus the Messiah. Key elements in the claim. 1. Vespasian is identified as the Jewish Messiah of prophecy. 2. Vespasian is equated with Jesus or another Jesus. This is presented. 3. This is presented as something Josephus wrote or clearly implied. What Josephus actually wrote from the Jewish War book 6, 312-313. There's the pages, right? Josephus mentioned an ambiguous prophecy. He says some Jews misinterpret it. We already covered that before, right? There is no claim that Vespasian was Jesus or a divine Messiah. Josephus never equates Vespasian with any religious figure, only a political one. Here's a point-by-point comparison. Claimed by Valliant, what Josephus actually says. Notes. Okay, what we've gone over before. Josephus interprets it politically, not religiously. Completely separate figures in his works in regards to another Jesus. Valliant is interpreting Josephus' text in a conspiratorial way, beyond what Flavius Josephus actually said or says. Conclusion. Valliant's statement is not what Josephus actually wrote. It's a radical interpretation or misreading, presenting Josephus as saying something he never did. From a historical perspective, it qualifies as a misrepresentation of the source, not a faithful quotation. And AI says, if I liked, it could outlay a sentence by sentence, side by side comparison of Valliant's claim as the actual versus the actual Josephus text. It's very clear where the leap occurs. That usually makes it obvious why historians reject this kind of claim. Would I like to do that? Okay. I said, yes, please. I said, perfect. Let's do a sentence by sentence, side by side comparison of Valliant's claim versus what Josephus actually wrote. This will make the misrepresentation very close. Very clear. Valliant's claims. Okay, we've gone over that. What Josephus actually wrote, the Jewish War Book 6, pages 312 to 313 translation. But now, what did most elevate them in understanding this war was an ambiguous oracle that was also found. We went over that. Okay. side-by-side breakdown. Valliant claims the man Josephus was working for the Roman Emperor Vespasian. Josephus mentions Vespasian as the emperor whose rise fulfilled a prophecy. His prophecy, right? He said he'd be the emperor. This part is factual. Vespasian is mentioned. Was in fact the Jewish Messiah prophecy. Josephus does not call Vespasian the Messiah. He describes the prophecy as ambiguous and says Jews misinterpret it. Okay. Notes discrepancy. Major misrepresentation. Josephus interprets prophecy politically, not religiously. Valliant's claim. In fact, another Jesus of the first century. Vespasian was another one. Okay. So he had the Christ and then he had this one, Vespasian. Josephus writes about Jesus separately in Antiquities, not connected to Vespasian. Okay, so this would be a fabricated connection. Josephus never links Jesus and Vespasian, if that's what this Valliant guy claims. This went against everything he had been taught. Okay, so this guy Valliant says, not applicable. This is Valliant's personal reflection, not in Josephus. Subjective commentary not relevant to Josephus' writings. Key takeaways. 1. Josephus never identifies Vespasian as Messiah. He only says the Jewish prophecy was politically fulfilled by Vespasian. 2. Jesus and Vespasian are completely separate figures in Josephus' works. 3. Valliant's statement combines political and religious elements that Josephus never combined. 4. This is why historians describe this kind of claim as a misrepresentation or distortion, not faithful reporting of the text. Okay, and then AI suggests it could also make a visual chart showing Vespasian versus Jesus in Josephus' works, which makes the distinction very obvious at a glance. This usually helps people understand why the documentary's claim is misleading and ask, do I want to do that? Okay, so it makes a clear visual chart, well, not a actual image chart, right? Okay, makes a clear visual chart comparing Vespasian and Jesus in Josephus' works. This makes it obvious that they are completely separate and that Valliant's claim is misleading. Okay, there's all the details here. These are the notes. Key observation from the chart: completely separate individuals. No messianic claim about Vespasian. No connection between the two. And Valliant's statement is a misrepresentation or misinterpretation or exaggeration, not a faithful report on Josephus. Okay, then AI says it could make a quick visual diagram showing these two figures, their roles and Josephus' sources, kind of like a side-by-side infographic, which is even easier to digest at a glance. And I said yes please, but it said to create a visual infographic using ChatGPT Canvas, you'll need to log into ChatGPT first. Once logged in, it can turn this side-by-side chart into an interactive visual diagram for me. So, unfortunately we can't play it, so you can hear it from his mouth, but basically you get the gist of what this guy claimed. Okay, we could turn it down and play it, but we're not going to take that chance because we might get a copyright strike or something like that. So we hope that this video gives you insight and makes you aware. Be very, very wary, very, very careful, alert, pay attention to what people claim, then go do the research for yourself and prove it true or completely false, as we did. Very interesting documentary, but there's probably other claims by these two men and others agree with it. Then you have this lady who's into the more mystical, psychic, all this sort of stuff, giving her 50 cents worth. We can leave the link to this particular documentary so you can go and watch it for yourself and then come to your own decisions. And if you like the idea that we brought this to you, simply subscribe to our channel, give us a like, add your comments below, the video and we'll get back to you. And then go share this with all your family, etc., whoever you know, your Christian friends, etc., to make them aware that there's these kind of documentaries that make these claims and people instantly believe them, okay, faster than 2-minute noodles. And they say, oh, it's true, it's true, it's true. They don't bother to do the research or anything like that. They take second-hand information and believe it instantly. So, thank you for taking the time to watch this, our latest video upload. We really hope you find it eye-opening, interesting and eye-opening.